I had been working within the community and would go on home visits on a regular basis. I would often come across cancer patients or people living with HIV and AIDS who were experiencing all kinds of pain and symptoms that we didn't have access to any kind of pain medication. It just wasn't available, it wasn't affordable, it wasn't something that the patients had any access to. So people were in the villages suffering, and it just felt like enough, it doesn't need to be like this. There was a couple of specific cases that awakened, I think, my heart and my mind to just how extensive the need was. I had gone on 2 home visits in one day to visit 2 children. It was with one of our social workers that I was working with at the time. And the first home was of a 2.5-year-old little girl, and her name was Flovia. She weighed about 12 pounds, and she was HIV positive. I found her lying on the floor of this little kitchen. It was a mud hut. She was dying. I was so moved by her, by her little life on this floor, and thought, I think we have to do something different than this. So, she was on the verge of starvation, and there were, many other contributing factors because of HIV and her being an orphan. But I went from her home to a second home of a child who was 14 months old, a little boy, very similar situation, HIV positive, again, severely malnourished, and just these little bodies and their arms and legs so wasted. And I just held him in my arms too and asked the question of, what does it look like? What does it mean to love in this situation? I came back from those 2 home visits that day, and I sat with David Tadrous, who's one of our national leaders, and another friend named Allison, and we just began to discuss the situation. And I just remember Allison saying, well, let's try. Let's try. And so we created this little treatment center in the clinic with 1 room and began to feed these babies every 2 hours.
She was really, you could think this child, we were waiting to be called at any time in the middle of the night that she passed away. But there was a secret. I think when you give somebody a total attention, and you do what is in your scope, and give your heart and attention and focus that person, something happens. And at the end of the day, we call it a miracle.
We did that for weeks and weeks, and after 6 weeks, little Felix, he went into respiratory distress, and he died very quickly. It was a painful loss because it was one that, we had so much hope and desire that it would be a different outcome. But we watched Flovia thrive, and she did learn to walk, and she began to speak 2 languages, and she would call everyone mom, mama. So she would call all the men, all the women, anyone in her life, mama, because we were the people who were loving her and taking care of her. After a few months of care, she was able to go to a children's home, and now it's all these years later, and to watch the life that's still in her is quite remarkable for me. That experience of taking care of those 2 children, one that passed away and one that came back to life, very much represents what the living room is, where hospice is so often associated only with death and end-of-life care. I feel like we have a unique opportunity just to provide care, that we leave the outcomes to God. They're out of our hands, but as far as us doing the best with what we have in this place is what living room is about.
Well, for most of us here, Juli may not need any introduction, but some of you may not know Juli. She is a BSN graduate of our program in 2001. you started with a dream. You started here at APU. So let's look in the rearview mirror for a minute and take us back to the budding of a dream.
Yeah, so I went to APU and I went to school with Karen, and some of you were my professors, and I came here wanting to be a nurse, and the summer after my junior year of nursing school, had the opportunity to go on a short-term trip to Kenya and to the village where I now call it my home. And I didn't have any intention on going on that summer trip. There was a friend of mine who wanted to go and didn't want to go to the information meeting by herself. And so I told her I would go to support her. And she didn't go on the trip, and I did. And it's been a good journey. So I went to Kenya in the summer of 2000, and I had an incredible experience of being in a community and in a village and being welcomed by Kenyan leaders who loved their people so much and cared about the well-being and the suffering of their community. And I experienced the devastation of what was going on with HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa at the time, before access to testing or treatment. And so I came back to APU to finish my senior year, and my last semester was assigned to work at the AIDS Service Center in Pasadena. And it just expanded something within my heart for people living with HIV. And so when I graduated, I started working at Cedars-Sinai in their infectious disease unit with HIV patients. And so I worked nights there for 3 years while I became a nurse practitioner. And then in 2004, I signed up to go for 1 year to Kenya. That was 19 years ago. And I went to Kenya for that 1 year, wanting to work alongside of other Kenyan leaders who were going into homes, who were visiting the sick, who were sitting beside people as they were taking their final breaths from a treatable disease that wasn't yet treated. And I experienced the devastation of that, as well as the possibility of what could be if testing and treatment became available. And that's, it's what happened. And I watched a community that was filled with so much fear and stigma for love to begin to reduce some of that fear. And it took time and it took a lot of work, but it was a really, really powerful experience. And then about 5 years into living in Kenya is when Living Room was started. So after we did a lot of mobilization, a lot of testing and treatment for HIV, sitting in the homes of many wonderful people, is when we felt like we needed to be able to provide inpatient services. And so in 2009 is when we started that. So there's obviously a very long story that I'll try to keep brief, but it's been I feel so grateful that when I moved to Kenya, or even different steps along the way, that I didn't have a full picture of what was to come, that it's been more of a step-by-step trying to be faithful with the things that are in front of us and working alongside of a team to actually see things that didn't feel possible actually come to pass.
So you touched a little bit on the budding of Living Room. Can you give us a little, you said there's a long story behind it. I'm sure after 20 years there is, but how did that kind of develop and fall into build into a hospital and a mortuary and the things that you do in a nutshell?
Well, I think the video that just played of the stories of Flovia and Felix and paying attention to the people right in front of us, one person at a time, is what grew into something much larger than what I imagined or originally anticipated. And it did so because we began working with other people who were like-minded and developed a vision statement for Living Room that we would be a community of compassion that honors life and offers hope, and everything we do would be filtered through that lens. And so that's what we did. And it's like, if we'll continue to pay attention to the person in front of us and know their worth and value and provide holistic care, then what might become, is the questions that we would ask. And what does it look like to love in this situation, and try to live that out in practical ways with excellence and with compassion. And so in 2010, we went from Flovia and Felix, and then we had an 8-bed temporary inpatient hospice, still doing community work. 2011, we built what is known as Kimbilio Hospice, which means refuge or a place to run to. That's 24 beds for adults and children. I would say that, we call it a hospice, but it's not a traditional hospice is what would be known here. There's components of rehab. A large percentage of our initial patients, almost extensively, they were HIV patients, and the goal was if they got on the right treatments with the right management, they could come back to life. And many, many did. And then we also do take care of a lot of cancer patients who have either very late diagnoses or maybe didn't even have access to treatment, who come and we take care of them. So Kimbilio Hospice is located about an hour's drive from where, at the time when we built, there was another mortuary. So the distance that if someone passed away, that a body would need to be taken was really, really significant. And so in 2012, we built a funeral home, and we offer mortuary services to a large community, both the hospice patients we take care of, but also the surrounding communities. There's a lot of stigma around death and bringing death close. And so the leaders in our community, they met with all the chiefs and other community leaders, and they said, this is something we'd like to do, but if it's not something that you want in this community, we will not bring it. And so there were multiple meetings, and over time it was decided to start the funeral home. And so that's been running for the last 11 years. We have close to 100,000 family members or loved ones who come through our gates each year to come to our funeral home. So a large number of people who we get to care for and minister to because of that service. And then in 2015, Vicki, were you there when our US board came to meet with our Kenyan board, and our beds were continuously full at Kimbilio, and a new cancer center had opened up in a city that's an hour away from us called Eldoret, and they were looking to us to really be the leads for hospice and palliative care for the region. And so we met as boards to discuss just the possibility of looking for land for a second site that would be closer to town. And the same day, I received a call from a lady I'd never met before. Her name was Kate, and her mother-in-law had just passed away, and she called because she wanted to donate furniture to Kimbilio Hospice. And so 2 days later, I went with one of our Kenyan leaders, and we drove into this beautiful piece of land that I had no idea could exist that close to the urban setting. And 2 weeks later, a long story short, we purchased that land that has now become Eldoret's living room hospital. And we began construction of that in 2017 and finished that in early 2019. And initially, the vision was that it would be very similar to Kimbilio, would offer hospice and palliative care services. It's 49 beds. And when we went to register it, the Ministry of Health said that they did not want it to be a specialty center, that it needed to be a community hospital. And so we've spent the last couple of years really navigating what that would look like and what that would mean for the community that we were then going to be serving. And so we've been adding additional services, including maternity and ICU and operating services, and now are getting ready to construct a large outpatient building with radiology and emergency department services. And it's been a big journey, and one where, we had 8,000 applications for 60 jobs initially. And David Tarus, who was in the video, he said it was our job to read all of them, because if someone took the time to apply, then it was for us to honor them. And so the desire to do things with excellence and compassion, and wanting our staff and our patients and the people we serve to know their value and to know their worth. And many of the people we serve are from very low income backgrounds. And so often they'll come into the gates and they'll feel like it's too good, it can't be for them. And so this idea of how do we create a space where we just continue to remind them that they're worth the care that we can give to them, and trying to do that in sustainable ways. So it is a long story, but that's my overview.
Oh, I love that. So let's just step into the life, your personal life that you've built. You walked into Kenya and thought you wouldn't be there long, but ended up building a life there. Tell us a little bit about you and your family there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been such a privilege to stay in one community for all of these years and to be welcomed there and to be known and accepted and to have community to be with during good times and hard times, where we definitely, the community I live in, I think Africa is so often known and referred to as a place that's resource poor. But there are certain things that are so rich. And hospitality is one of them. And the way that I've learned about being welcomed, the way we've been able to translate that into our hospital and hospice settings, to the point where we don't refer to our patients as patients, but guests, because we want them to know that they're welcomed and loved and the reason we exist. So I'm married to a Kenyan for the last almost 12 years, and we have a biological daughter named Ella, and we have 4 adopted guardians to children, where in 2016, on a Friday afternoon, I had come to do rounds at Kimberleo, and there was a 3-pound baby whose mom had died in childbirth, and I was told that the father had died in a roadside accident a couple months prior to that. So on the day of this baby's birth, he was a total orphan. And it's the only time in my 20 years of being there that, I called Titus and I said, this is not the right place for this baby. And I want him to live. And so we took him to a hospital where he spent a couple of weeks in the NICU. And then when it was time to come home, Titus met with extended family members, and Ryan was the youngest of 8 brothers and sisters. And so he came to our home, and about a month into caring for Ryan, my husband one night was holding the flashlight while I was changing Ryan's diaper because our power was out again. And he said, he doesn't need to go anywhere. And I said, what? And he said, he doesn't need to go anywhere. And we didn't talk about it any more than that at that point. That was enough for one day. But again, very long story short, we began the adoption process for Ryan. The other siblings' living room has community-based programs, orphan vulnerable children programs. So we were helping to care for them and making sure the kids were in school and clothed and fed and taken care of. But at 6 months old, Ryan was diagnosed with sickle cell disease. And then shortly after that, we obviously needed to test the other kids. And Geoffrey, who was 2 or 3 at the time, was also had sickle cell. And then Alice, who was 7, had sickle cell disease. And in Kenya, it's estimated that between 50 to 90% of children living with sickle cell disease die before the age of 5. So comparatively to here, where the life expectancy is 50 years old, it's a big, big difference. And so our family began to navigate that and what that might look like for us. And so within time, Geoffrey and Alice, who was a 7-year-old with sickle cell, and then eventually Sharon, who was one of the siblings, those 4 children came to live with us. In 2017, there's no bone marrow transplants in Kenya or in Africa. And so we were able to come to Los Angeles because Sharon was a matched sibling donor for the brothers, for Geoffrey and Ryan, and Alice did not have a matched sibling in any of the brothers and sisters. But we came here for 477 days and lived with a family in Los Angeles while Joffrey and Ryan underwent their bone marrow transplants. And so they are cured of sickle cell disease. And we moved back to Kenya in early 2019, just as our hospital in Eldoret the construction was being finished and we were getting ready to open it. And so one of the things that I feel like has shifted within me, or maybe not shifted, but expanded greatly within me over the last 7 years, is the lens through which I see through the lens of motherhood so often in the ways that I think about the patient care that we provide, the ways that we run the hospital, the questions that I ask on a daily basis. They come from that experience of sitting at the bedside for months and months and months, watching other nurses beautifully care for my kids, watching as doctors came in the room or nurses came in the room, and the way communication was handled. And I just I paid attention and I listened and I learned and I thought about what can it look like when other mothers come into our hospital, when other children sit in the bed, what do we want their experience to be like? What do we want to make available? And so those are a lot of the things that I feel like at this point of the journey that I've really I process all the time and I think about and dream about. And so this year, in January, we opened a guest house at our Eldoret site that is a 64-bed guest house for children who are from all over Kenya who are undergoing cancer treatment at the nearby government hospital and need a place to stay. So it resembles what a Ronald McDonald House would look like here. So we have space for the children and their parents, and it is one of the most sacred things that I think I've ever been able to be a part of and to witness and to watch our team grow in the ways that we're extending the hospitality to these families.
So I think you brought us to your first book that you put out last year, From Beyond the Skies. The back of that book, one of the things Juli says is to pass it on. And so I was just talking to someone last night to say, wonder where that book is. I think it's gone through 3 or 4 people. Mm-hmm. And that's the intent of it. So please read that. And we want to, now you have just published your second book, and you talk very deeply about the experience of being in the hospital, being in a foreign country, which, the U.S. became not your home. And then the healing that had to take place within you after watching your kids go through such hardship.
Yeah, so Brave Love is the new book that just came out on Monday. And I feel like the book, it chronicles the 20 years that I've lived in Kenya and the stories that initially I thought might sit side by side, but it feels much more like they're woven together. They're more of a single story than many individual ones. And the book begins with us coming home. So this idea of having the healing that we longed for our kids, and also the trauma that the treatment created, and to begin to process that and to work through that, and to know that it wasn't possible just to jump into the next phase of life and into a new hospital as if nothing had happened, because something so significant had happened within our family's lives and within me as an individual, as a mother, and also as a healthcare advocate and a leader, and what would become, I think, again, back to the vision of Living Room, is there's certain values that we have that I've so long believed for others that I needed to lean into for myself and to hold for myself, and to trust that those things that so long we've loved others with, how could I make room for them, for myself and for my family too.
That's good. That's hard for a nurse to do, I think, sometimes. So that's nice to hear. And I think that the book will will speak to that.
I think there's something really powerful that also requires the vulnerability to receive it, is that for so long as a nurse, we can be the helper, but there is something powerfully learned and experienced by being the one who needs to receive help also, that we talk, like I was saying, that we refer to our patients as guests, as the person we're receiving, and often, we're the hosts. But one of the most powerful experiences when one of our guests, one of our patients becomes one of our staff members, where they reverse the roles that they had before, but from their lived experience as someone who is welcomed, how they can then also extend that to others. And so for me, I went from the nurse or the host to the one who needed a space to stay and who needed the help for my kids to be able to survive. And then in going back and being on the other side again, how does that reshape how I think and how I dream and how I envision the healthcare that we're trying to provide?
Will you just share maybe a story from the book or one not in the book that kind of chronicles living room in a nutshell? I threw that one on you, so.
Yeah, so there's a patient who came to us in 2011, a man who was a teacher in Nairobi and was shot and became paralyzed and lived in the government hospital for an extended period of time and got just really extensive bed sores that by the time he came to us, he thought he was going to die and that they were never going to get better. And he had lost his job, he had lost his livelihood, he lost so much of the drive for life. And so he came and he would just stay under the blanket it was a long time. And our team just kept trying holistically, physically, emotionally, spiritually, caring for this man. His name is Jacob. And with time, we're often asked if the miracles happen. And I said, well, often it depends how you define a miracle, because I feel like love little by little by little that brings something that in days feels impossible often can feel like a miracle. And we see that kind of thing happen all of the time. But for Jacob, we, with a lot of time and a lot of patience, we saw those wounds become clean, and then we could get the flap repairs and do a lot of physical therapy. And over an extended period of time, we were able to get him well enough to go back to the community. And then about a year later, there was another child who had been burned who looked very similar to Jacob as far as really feeling like there was not hope, like she would never go to school again, she would never get better. And when she said, I'm never going to go to school again, we called Jacob and we asked if he would become the teacher. And so he's come back to Kimberleo, and he now comes 3 days a week and teaches the kids at our hospice who come. And, I feel, well, he would say that he's the greatest champion for living room, because he knows what it's like to be in the bed and to feel like there's not hope, and then to be on the other side where it's not a nice and neat, perfectly tied up story. I mean, he still has many struggles, but that he knows has value and worth and wants to keep living, and he wants that for others too. So
I feel a school is coming.
A school?
A bigger school.
Well, so then what happened is we had a child named Brighton who had fallen from a tree and was paralyzed and had bed sores, and Jacob was his teacher, and we got the bed sores controlled and we did physical therapy. And we knew if we sent him back to the community that there were not schools that were wheelchair accessible. And so we decided the school that was in our community, that we would make it a school that Brighton could go to and that others like Brighton could go to. And so we adapted the school to become a place where people like Jacob could teach or Brighton could attend. And so on the day that Brighton wheeled himself up the path where he could go to class, and the other students were running alongside of him. You know, like I felt it so deeply of, you know, this must mean, you know, this must be what it meant when Jesus said, let the little children come to me, you know. And so this year we have another little girl, a similar situation where she's also in a wheelchair and she's now in the school. So, I mean, there might be more schools, but that's where we've landed to this point. Yeah, it's incremental. Mm-hmm.
And there's so much depth in the stories that you write, and you'll sit there and read it in 2 days, and your heart will be moved, as was mine. I think the theme that you that runs throughout it, and it resonates with me, is that mantra. What does it look like to love in this situation?
And you know, that's a question we can ask anywhere we are, within our homes and communities and schools. And I like to say, I hope it's true that, you know, this question and the life that I've been allowed or privileged to live, like, I hope that it would, if I was anywhere, that I would still be asking that question, and I would still be leaning into the things, the opportunities that are in front of me to be interrupted and to pay attention and to notice the ways that God is at work. And so,
originally your book was going to be titled Love Makes Us Brave, and it's called Brave Love now. But if I remember right, did your son make that statement, one of your little guys?
no, somewhere in the middle of the transplant time, I came across it, or I started saying, love makes us brave, and it also makes us tired, is what I said. It's like, and then we also say that, you know, like, well, love is patient and love is kind, but like, do we have to be both at the same time? Because it feels like it's asking a lot, and it is. But the other aspect about bravery or courage is, you know, I used to think of being brave like Braveheart, where, you know, it's like it's unafraid, rather than what I've come to know it as, which is it's a willingness, like in those moments where we still might be afraid or we are uncomfortable, where we're willing to lean in and look when it'd be easier to look away, and to listen when I'd rather walk out of the room. So there's a quote by a palliative care doctor named Sunita Puri, where she says almost that. She says that that I've learned to stay when I'd rather run out of the room, and that the prelude to compassion is a willingness to see. And I think that there's great truth in that.
So we have a video of Micah's house that I think we'd like to show, and then we can open this up to our audience to ask some questions of Juli.
The need for the guest house was evident to our team, to myself, before our family traveled 10,000 miles to Los Angeles for our boys to receive their bone marrow transplants, and before a family so generously welcomed us.
The people who come to stay in the guest house are the mothers who are traveling many miles. Chemotherapy in Eldoret majority is outpatient program.
It was something that I'd thought at some point, like, we need to offer this to families, that children could come from far distances who are undergoing cancer treatment at a nearby government hospital, but they need a place to stay. And currently they were sleeping on the floor of the government hospital in the corridors at night, and then getting their chemotherapy in the day. And I just, as a mom who had slept beside my kids while they were receiving their chemotherapy, I just couldn't imagine that being okay.
Without the guest house, I don't know if most of them would have even completed the treatment, because the journey is long, the frustrations are many, the financial constraints, and having a place to sleep, a warm space to sleep, to have their children away from the needles, from the hospital environment, away from the doctors, it makes even healing possible.
Micah's guest house is located on our living room Eldred campus. It's about a 5-minute drive from the government hospital where these children are receiving their oncology services, their chemotherapy, their radiation therapy. The guest house has 64 beds in it, and so we're able to take care of a child plus a parent, or sometimes it's a sibling that accompanies the child, and they've traveled from all over the country, many hours, and they need a place to stay. Almost every family that we serve in the guest house, they come from a low income background, and we didn't want cost to be the prohibiting factor. We're offering the accommodation and the care that we provide to these families for free. It costs about $10 a day for the child and parent to stay with us, for us to be able to feed and care for them. And we just feel like that's something we want to be able to offer them, and for it not to be another burden for them to have to think about.
They ask a lot of questions. Why? Why me? Because majority of them, they think they don't deserve it. And we always say all these have been done because somebody loves you and he cares for you. And when they hear that, for the first 3 or 4 days, they are watching. If really, is this us? Even when they are given a room, a mother and a child, that they are not sharing with anybody else, they are sharing as a family, and they receive a meal, they receive warm water to shower. You can hear the mother knowing that somebody is thinking about them and is laughing about them. Now we are giving children who are traveling from many miles to get an opportunity to be there, to be served very early in the morning.
We don't control whether these kids will survive, will be cured of their cancer, but we can make this season of treatment one where the families know that they aren't alone, know that they are seen and loved, and that's the opportunity that we feel like we have.
I think one of the best things I love about my role is that we are creating community here with our alumni. And those of you that, can I get a raised hand if you're here and you're an alum of APU? Oh, yay. But we want to be a place and a source, just like Juli experienced in her community, for encouragement, for support, for development. And so I'm so glad that you're here, and I hope that you will join us in the future. We have an exclusive online nursing group called apuconnect.com. So if you aren't on there, I invite you to join, and I would love to hear from you and have a Zoom date with you. So connect with me afterwards. So with that, I want to mention our board that we have over there. That board is just a chance for you to respond for what you've heard today and leave a message. It's going to sit in nursing. And so if you would like to do that before you leave, we invite you to just respond to what you've heard today. You're a nonprofit running in Kenya. How does that interact with the government and your cooperation or resistance that they might have to your being there?
So Living Room is a non-governmental organization registered within Kenya, and we're registered through all of the Ministry of Health's governing bodies. And I think that we haven't been seen as competition because we're Kenyan-led. So it's 150 Kenyans who are running the organization at this point. So I get to be a part of it, but I am not the face or the voice of Living Room in Kenya. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful for all of the Kenyans who I get to learn from and walk alongside to see this come to be. So, I mean, I think that it would be a very different journey and experience if I would have gone and not had Kenyans who were leading. Mm-hmm.
So do you resource? How are you funded?
Yeah, so we're registered as a 501c3 in the States, so we do fundraising here. We have established global partners from all over the world who are helping to support and people who come to visit us in Kenya. One of our goals from very early on is that we would be working towards sustainability, not necessarily that we would be 100% of our operations covered by income generating activities and businesses within Kenya, but we wanted to work towards making sure that as much as possible, we would have funds coming from internally. So our funeral home is a paid service. And so at Kimberley-O, about 25% of our operation budget is covered by the profits of the funeral home. Our hospital in Eldoret, this is probably for another day, a very long explanation, but Kenya has National Health Insurance Fund that if a family can pay $5 a month, then they can have health insurance. Almost all private hospitals, they won't let a person with an NHIF come and not pay on top of that. But we signed up to have a comprehensive NHIF so that if the lower income people could come and receive care within our facility. And so we're really working towards that hospital being sustainable from the National Health Insurance reimbursement. And we're not there yet, but we're committed towards baby steps towards that.
Can you speak to quality of life when there's nothing else you can fix? Because I'm sure you're faced with that in your hospital. Things can't be fixed.
Yeah, I mean, I think anywhere in the world where people are dying and you're sitting alongside and you're wanting to be present and you're wanting to know what is important to them in this moment. And sometimes they're not verbal, or, there's other family dynamics, just trying to stay present. In my first book, one of the things I talk about is a mantra that I began to follow when my son's complications from the transplant landed us in the ICU. And it was now here at this, like, how do I pay attention right now? And how do I love right now? Even if I don't like what right now feels like or looks like. And I think those translate, within our practice too. And the other thing, and this would be more specific for Christians, but is don't get ahead of God. Like, don't get ahead of where you are in this moment. And I don't mean like there's not planning or there's not those things, but like, how do I not get ahead of where I am in this moment, where God has us this moment? It's been really important for me.
And I think even as you talked about living room, you had vision, but living room was built one step at a time.
Yeah, and I mean, I know that there are visionaries who have the whole big master plan and then step by step lead into that, like that. And that would be great. It's just not the story that I've lived or experienced. I really felt like when I moved to Kenya that people were dying alone, and that wasn't okay. And it wasn't like I was going to be the one to fix that, but like, could I be a part of sitting alongside? And so that was the first step. And then this question of what does it look like to love in this situation? What if we just keep asking it, where might it lead us? And I think that's what has happened.
And I think you just said yes to God, and then just kept saying yes to God.
Yeah, and realizing it's like we don't ever arrive, like there's a continual wanting to be faithful to the thing in front of us, even if you're not certain of what that means. This is not about like always getting it right. There's a lot of steps where it's like, well, I may have done that different if I, in hindsight, but, God is gracious and continues to lead us. So.
Well, thank you all very much for your time. I know it's valuable, and you invested an hour with us, and we are so glad you're here. So thank you, and stick around. I would love to get to know you. Come say hi.